welcome to the show. My name is Jason, and I'm here with Dimitri. This is our new show, our premiere episode, and we just wanted to talk a little bit about in this show why it is that we want to do this in the first place. There's a lot of different podcasts out there, and there's a lot of different places that people can go for news or for information, or even just to share ideas. And we sort of asked ourselves what made us want to start doing a podcast in the first place. And it had been sort of something that we both flirted with for I think a few years, and it was really the last, the epidemic or the pandemic, that has been really the thing that was the prime motivator to get something in. Like, things, have been getting pretty crazy and sort of continue to be modestly insane, and we want to sort of jump into the fray and sort of figure things out. I think, in combination with people that might listen to us, or even if it's just the two of us talking together, figuring out what is the best way out of this. Because right now, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world, and I think we want to sort of help find answers in some way. So that's basically what this we're hoping that this podcast will become. We still don't have a name for it. But maybe we will by the time this goes to air, and maybe I'll just edit this part out. To start with, I'll say the thing that sort of made this whole idea of feeling like I needed to do a podcast, the thing that really drove it home for me was sort of a fight that I had with my dad. And when I say fight that I had with my dad, it was a very, the fights that we would have are pretty mild by comparison. I think what most people would think of it when we fight. My dad is a fairly easygoing person, and we had for a long time, the kind of relationship where we disagreed on a lot of things, but we would have very respectful conversations with each other, and we'd have debates to some extent on various issues, and we would usually fall on different sides, but we could always sort of come to an understanding, and I think it would, it always seemed to sort of work out in the end, and we'd go for a beer and blah, blah, blah. Everybody was happy. But over the COVID pandemic, things got a little bit crazy. Yeah, my dad and I had always been the type of people that would, we'd go out for beers, we'd talk politics, and we're both pretty into politics, pretty into current events, the news, history, stuff like that. A lot of our conversations would, over the years, get to be, they were fairly rich with, I always found myself learning something from them at the end of the day, and I always felt more, I understood the issue more comprehensively because of his input. And, I hope he did the same for me, but maybe not as much. But it was, I was also, a kid for part of it, and I just wasn't as wise to say that I am now. But I do feel like now I can at least bring something to the conversation or a perspective.
But why, can I?
Yeah.
Why, what do you think has changed now that has made it into a different, this amicable sort of disagreement? What has happened now that has changed it fundamentally to be able to disagree with people you love the most, who brought you onto this earth, but now this schism is just so huge?
Yeah, it's a good question. I asked myself this, and because it's a massive fissure. It's not like it's well, we agree to disagree and let's go have our beer now. It was I think probably started around the time of Trump. I think when Trump got elected, it became it was just. And, some of that was Trump, some of it was just his personality, and some of it was the media reaction to that. And whatever the case, this sort of maelstrom of just polarizing opinions seemed to be bouncing around every space. And it certainly found its way into, I found myself at the time getting more and more skeptical of what I was hearing on the news and in the media.
Almost like Trump was sort of such a polar counter reaction to the mainstream narrative that people found themselves either on completely one side of the schism or the other side, and that sort of middle ground where people could find some overlap just completely collapsed.
Yeah, right.
You know, where I never felt such a divide between left and right, or different just change of thought in general. Like there was very little room for middle ground, and if you were in the middle, you were considered to be kind of wishy-washy and hadn't thought clearly about the issues.
Right.
And if you had thought clearly, you would have picked one side or the other side, and that's it.
Yeah. And he's an easy figure to be polarizing about, because he is a very bombastic kind of guy, and he's like, comes off as arrogant, he's sexist, like there's a million like negative adjectives you could ascribe to him.
Yeah.
But you would get people, like I think the argument on one side would be that, well, yeah, he is, but he's also a real person, which is almost doubtful to some capacity. But it's like, a lot of politicians are like this, sort of have the same characteristics. It's not as visible, or it's not as does it make Trump a, and I don't want to go down a whole thing with Trump. Like and to be clear, like I was never a Trump fan. Like I always thought I think that his time in politics, it really took down the office of the presidency. It took down the respect of America abroad. But
that taking down the respect of the establishment, let's say, including whether it's regulatory bodies or the White House itself, also be part of where people no longer can. If you're not going to respect the presidency, maybe people aren't going to respect each other's personal opinions on the street anymore either. Like respect in general has just completely faded.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to meet a jerk on the street and disagree or whatever, but then like, okay, but this is a doctor, this is a PhD, this is the president of America.
Yeah,
there's a certain level of respect. But when all the priests have been caught doing something, next thing you know, you don't want to respect the church or maybe anything else in society. Like everything just crumbles from that point. Yeah. Like every culture needs its narrative. And when you start to blow these foundational pieces out of the water, then you're left at the dinner table with your own family not agreeing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Actually, when the fissures run so deep that you have, the president of the United States, just being such a again polarizing figure, where the things that he's saying, and like he's just not doing it the way that people used to do it.
And they're supposed to be of a higher mind. Like it's one thing for us to sort of be belligerent with somebody, your family member. There's no filter because you've known them for 40 years of your life.
Yeah.
But when you hear the people in power talking the same way, then all sort of civility and conversation just erodes.
Yeah, he sounded like the sort of uneducated jock in high school who's just kind of like running his mouth off, and you just kind of roll your eyes and be like, okay, Donald.
Or everybody's crazy uncle.
Yeah, or everybody's crazy uncle. But that being said, in terms of like, if you strip away his personality, like he was in power and his administration did do some positive things, like, you know what I mean? So it can't all be bad. And the media narrative was that it was all bad. He was, a Russian agent, all this stuff. Like it was just so out of control.
He could have cured cancer and they still would have found negative about it. Or even when the vaccines came out, was it Kamala? I'm not taking it if Donald Trump says it's good.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Yeah, that's horrible.
Now she has to run around and say, you better get your vaccine or you're going to lose your career.
Yeah, right.
So now people are like, what the hell am I supposed to believe in?
Yeah, that's a good point, because it really, you have on the one hand Trump denigrating the office by his behavior. She's doing just the same by denigrating, because she's showing a lack of faith in everything, in government, in the process, and the democratic process.
The very institutions that he is saying are going to create the solution to the problem, she's denigrating them. Yeah. And then when she's in power, she's like, no, these are fabulous and you must take them. Otherwise, we're going to have all these repercussions against you.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think the polarization started there. I think the media found a bone they could latch onto, the sort of dying media. They were already sort of on their way out. And it was like, Trump was almost like incredible to me how they used to bash him, because he was really their meal ticket for so long.
100%.
And they were in the Donald Trump bashing business. And
CNN is in the middle now of downsizing. They're in huge financial trouble. Their numbers have never been lower.
Yeah, because Biden doesn't go around, he has his own moments, but like...
You can only watch Sleepy Grandpa for so long.
Right. But I think the polarization started there, and the fact that I wasn't just bashing Trump along with everybody else, because it really makes me suspicious when I see CNN or CBC. Like, don't forget, these are the networks that would, went along with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Like, there's constant like lies being pushed, and so when they're saying, when you hear them saying all these things about Trump, and then you're sort of reading deeper and being like, well, actually, he did, they'll, a lot of, so this is, I can't think of something off the top of my head, but like, a lot of, sometimes he would say something and, you would hear about it on the news and then you would fact check it. And it's like, oh no, he actually didn't say that. Or they took his clip out of context where he said something. It's like, well, actually what he said in context did make sense.
Just by nature, when something goes all in on one side, I get very skeptical. Because nobody's inherently very 100% evil, 100% good.
Yeah.
So if they're just telling you this person is 100% evil, every single thing he touches, does, administers, talks about is wrong and antithetical to what America is all about. That just can't be the case.
Right.
So now I got to deal with the idiocy of Donald Trump, but also with the perceived, what is a truth that's being thrown at him and not truth.
Yeah.
Because it can't be all just the way they're saying it.
Yeah.
And then you end up in the middle somewhere, which can be a political faux pas, because then you're back into the center again. Everyone's like, well, what do you mean? Pick a side, man. You gotta choose your master. And that hollowness, that hollowing out of the middle has never existed in my lifetime.
Right. Yeah.
Usually people gravitated towards the middle and flirted with the edges.
Yeah.
Now we're picking the edges and flirting somewhat with the middle.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and I want to get more to that later because there's I do think that that's kind of crucial. So coming back to the whole polarizing force of Donald Trump, I think was where the whole fissure with my dad began, and it was sort of paralleled in Canada with Trudeau, and I was never a Trudeau fan from the get-go, and and I'm happy. Maybe we'll have another episode. We could just get into just a big long Trudeau bashing.
I was very optimistic initially.
Yeah. Yeah. There was maybe a moment of time where I was like, you never know. Yeah. But he really my initial impression of him was negative, and then I was kind of like, give him a chance. Don't be. I didn't vote for him,
well, but he's certainly the most unqualified person to ever take office.
Yeah, yeah.
From an academic and
for sure,
scholastic. Occupational point of view.
Yeah.
It's really like having the babysitter take over the country. He hasn't done much of any notable thing whatsoever before he took office. But I was going more in the spirit of, is he a good guy? Is he got strong morals? Mm-hmm. Is he going to try to heal some of the division that came out during Harper? And of course, at the time we were dealing with radical Islam and things like that, and it was getting very testy. I'm like, someone in the middle might be exactly the recipe we need emotionally at this point in time. And then hopefully he would surround himself with very qualified individuals, and you got a running team. That's okay. That's an okay platform for me in order to build your party off of.
Yeah.
But the Huffington Post ran a 2014 story at the time. We'll get back to your dad in a sec, but I remember, and it just kind of resurfaced. Is Trudeau in 2014 a dictator? Because he was mandating that everybody on the Liberal Party must vote for, pro-choice, and if you didn't, you're off his team.
2014. When did he come into office?
2015.
Oh, I see. I see.
So
okay.
Somewhere right there. The article I believe came out 2014, and so. Even the Huffington Post, which is very left of center, it was like, how can you tell your own party members how they're supposed to vote? And if you don't vote this way, you're off the team.
Right.
That should have set off red flags. What is this man's true nature? Is he the healer I was looking for? Or is he sort of a sheep in wolf's clothing?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's wolf in sheep's clothing.
Correct.
Yeah. But either way.
Yeah. I will do a lot of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think in retrospect, it's easy to kind of look back, and you can always find somebody, and Huffington Post, that is interesting because it's they are very. I would think they would have been his biggest cheerleader, but that's interesting to hear that. I think as the years went on with Trudeau in office, and things would come out I just obviously the Jody Raybould thing was the fact that my dad was still sort of I wouldn't say cheerleading him, but he was a Liberal Party. Mm-hmm. And by the way, getting back to what you said, I do think I agree with you in that at the time when Harper was sort of in his final years was there needed to be some sort of a change. Like it was getting a little stale,
Yeah.
and and I think that he overall, like if you look back, he did a pretty good job. But it was you could sense that there needed to be some sort of a change, and maybe Trudeau at the time it seemed like a breath of fresh air. Like, but. Because we're still relegated to like I mean you could say we have more parties running than just Democrats and Republicans because we're in Canada, but it's not much more. Like it's like and nobody really realistic. Like
Oh, for sure. No, Trudeau sort of won on a de facto. There was no strong competition.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I don't know if it pertains to Trudeau or his those around him, but there's a certain amount of like emotional intelligence I think he has. He can read a room, he can read a vibe.
Yeah.
Maybe it's when you're on trend and you can just see where the world is going and you
Right.
can just kind of see the arc of time unfolding
Yeah.
in front of your eyes. And there was that one commercial where I think he was losing to both the NDP and PC party in the polls when they first started campaigning. And they had one very famous TV commercial where he was walking up the escalators that were coming down. And as he got to the top of it, he kind of said, we're all about change. We're going to do things different. And the metaphor of walking against the escalator going down and Trudeau being sort of very physically active and a dynamic kind of person.
Yeah.
Just really, I think that really, and he said, no, we're going to spend money and go actually a little bit into deficit because we need to build the country forward. And I think that resonated. I think people got tired of the penny pinching a little bit and whatnot.
Right.
Unfortunately now.
They had no idea what a spendthrift he was. But.
Yes. So that might have been fine in normal times, but that personality trait throughout the pandemic has created the greatest debt we've ever had, in the country.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I don't know the commercial you mean, but it reminds me of the Donald Trump coming down when he announced his presidency, like that kind of thing, where it was impactful.
There are strange parallels, I think, to Trudeau and Trump, where they were both elected mostly on their superficial features.
Right. Yeah.
For different reasons. We're a different country from America, but neither were like a deep man's thinking's position.
Right.
Sort of thing. He's like, I like the vibe, I like the energy, I like the direction, I like the sort of image the person portrays.
Yeah.
That's my gut feeling. That's my alpha male, let's say, or alpha female, whatever. But in the age of Putin and dictators around the world, I think every country was looking for their own dynamic leader to match up. And when you were to put Hillary versus Putin versus Trump versus Putin, a lot of people instinctually are just going to vote for Trump because they see the matchup as a better for their side rather than Hillary.
Yeah.
And I think the same sort of thing with Trudeau.
Yeah, I mean, you've only got two choices, so it really does become unfortunate. Like, but that's it becomes a lesser of evils in many ways. And I think a leader is first and foremost a symbolic figurehead. So like you don't necessarily even have to be like a deep thing. Like you don't have to be. It was like Joe Clark or like who's the other one? Stefan. What is it? Stefan. He was running for. I remember when he won and he was a big environmentalist, and I was like, I even at the time I was like, you know what, good. I hope this guy really this was in I think the mid 2000s.
Yeah,
but
I think I was gone because I remember the name somewhat.
Yeah. But he couldn't. I mean, he was just had the charisma of a dying turtle. Like it was like there was no, anything he got voted out the next a year later or something. But those were people who probably had a lot better ideas. They just didn't have that magnetism that you get in like a Trudeau or a Trump. But magnetism only sort of gets you so far.
Especially in a crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, you kind of want somebody who knows what they're doing. And the whole thing with Wilson Raybould, where I would say look, I told you this guy's a kind of a tyrant. Like there's a lot of things he's doing, and it's like my dad would sort of pass it off like it's like, well, there's always corruption. You know what I mean? There's always something, and there was a thing with SNC Lavalin where that whole thing came around the same time. It's like. Yeah, a lot of things like that, and
for only a 5-year period or so he's been in, he's won 3 elections. There's a lot of scandals.
6
years now.
Yeah, but and it was, and like I said, it wasn't like my dad was an apologist for him, and he sort of recognized the whole situation. He's like, look, I'd rather him still. It's the Liberal Party. I'm voting for this and that, and it's like, okay, fair enough, but it's just that. Some of the stuff would get really bad, and it really sort of, and then, get later in when the pandemic started, and there's, things just kind of went off the rails. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I was one of the first people. Like I would follow that little chart that when it just was in China, and I was like watching the numbers, and I was like, oh, because it's like all those end of the world scenarios are
It's
just
like
fascinating
a
to me.
high scoreboard. How many deaths do we have today? How many infections?
Exactly.
Let's
you
watch the numbers go up.
and look to see if it went to another country, and then would go to Italy, and you're like, ooh, like what's and then when it came here, and we had our first case in Toronto, I stopped taking the TTC. I was like, you know what, I don't want to be anywhere near this. I don't know what's going on with it, and I was like, everyone was kind of like, oh, what do you I would get a lot of like sort of eye-rolling behaviors if I was, a germaphobe, which, to some extent I guess I am, but I didn't want to be anywhere near it. And I think that's, in retrospect, funny that, it's almost like the opposite reaction I get now when I talk about these things, but we didn't know what it was. And it was like...
well, I would say you were ahead of the curve. You were ahead of the curve in terms of being proactive. You saw things coming. I was the same. I was wearing gloves outside because it was more contact-based and we didn't know, definitely gloves at while pumping gas, sort of thing.
Right. Yeah.
By late February, March 1st, I just had a lot of latex gloves around. I'm like, I'll just put these on, no problem. I don't know what's going on. Grocery shopping, let's put some gloves on. It was all about the gloves the first 6-8 weeks or so. The masking didn't come in until like April, May, June at some point.
Well, because I think it was contact. A lot of people thought it was, you'd get it from picking up. I remember sterilizing my groceries constantly.
100%. But also, I think then you're also ahead of the curve to know when the majority of the danger has passed now.
Yeah.
And science is, you're reading the science and your instinct, and you're seeing what's going on number-wise, whether it's natural immunity and vaccine. Really, once you've got 80-90% of the population vaccinated, which would have been in Canada September, October, November at that point, I would call it over. If not, for all intents and purposes, it's over because we've done the major step.
Yeah.
Everything else would be sort of like small things to keep it going, a little masking, perhaps here or there, going into a hospital setting, TTC, sure. Maybe 75% capacity, not 100%, sure. But to then have to go through a full lockdown after that while watching the rest of the world open up simultaneously was... So I just think, to your point, I think you were ahead of the curve being proactive, and you've been ahead of the curve knowing when the exit is nearing.
Right.
But some people have latched onto this so deeply, they just can't let go now.
Yeah.
Like we're almost, I would say we are adaptable to a fault. And many kids even are just used to wearing the mask now and feel almost like naked if they're not wearing it.
Right. Yeah, it's a weird psychological dynamic.
And to your going back to your father and just sort of the trying to figure out why the difficulties are more now. If you were to ask your dad, where do you fall on this topic? And have him answer it regardless of the party affiliation. What do you think on taxation? What do you think on hospitals? What do you think on university care? And then actually measured that as a score. I bet you he wouldn't be as positioned where he's actually saying he's positioned. I think people just kind of inherently gravitate to a certain team and blow off a lot of these scandals and whatnot. But if you actually lined them up and gave it a sort of score, tabulated a result, he'd probably fall a little bit to the left of where he's saying or a little bit to the right, but not exactly where he's portraying himself to be. That's just familiarity and comfort, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, even before the vaccines came out, I sort of had my doubts in the sense that, and I know how this sounds very bumpkinish to say this, but it's like I've never gotten the flu and I've never gotten the flu vaccine. So to me, this is just another coronavirus. It's like, okay, I get that it's serious, and I get that it's not like I know better than the doctors, but I know my body. I know what I've done before, and I can read a risk. I can do a risk analysis of something. So it's like, for me, I thought the risk did not seem that great. I wanted us to achieve herd immunity. Or if for some reason the vaccines were this spectacular thing and there was no dissenting opinions and it was just like, then maybe I'll get the vaccine. I don't know, but to me it just didn't make sense. Like with the risk profile and given that I was of sort of middle age or younger middle age and
how dare you? You're thinking for yourself.
I know, no comorbidities. So it just didn't make sense for me to get it, to put in something that was experimental and at the time. I sort of told everybody that, but I guess the news sort of didn't percolate to my dad because he had a big birthday party in 2021, and I sort of I was on the phone like just asking what to bring, and I was like, oh, by the way, and like kind of a bit of a dick move to not sort of give him a heads up beforehand, but it literally didn't occur to me. I thought he knew, and I said, yeah, just so you know, I haven't been vaccinated, so I don't know if you want me to like, and
was this summerish 2021?
yeah, it was July.
It's like the numbers are at very low levels.
Yeah, they were
Summertime.
low. Yeah, and it was like, and to me, and I think the day, I think it was like it could have gone both ways because he has a big yard and everything. And it was like, okay, it would probably be outside anyway. So I was like, no problem, right? But then, then it started getting cloudy. I'm like, well, just so you know, if it rains or whatever, we go inside. I'm not vaccinated. Like, my girlfriend's vaccinated. Like, and I'll wear a mask inside, whatever. And we got into this back thing. It was this whole thing, and it was like, oh, like, why are you not vaccinated? It was just, and we started having a bit of a back and forth. And at this point, I was listening to Dark Horse a lot, and I was really kind of into, I was like, well, why are they using ivermectin? Like, why is this not even being explored? And I was getting really skeptical about the motivations behind pushing these vaccines and all the censorship on Google, YouTube, and everything like that. I was like, this seems very, if somebody's telling you, don't look into this, like we're going to put this box over here in a corner. Don't ever open this box. It's well, I want to open the box.
Well, it's a very similar energy. Once again, if you were saying, like you were saying before, the news saying Trump was 100% evil, and that was the only direction you could go.
Yeah.
Just by virtue of like not letting any wiggle room for some gray matter to appear. Yeah. Like I'm skeptical because nothing can be 100% one way or the other.
Right.
So then when all of a sudden the vaccines are safe and effective, and Biden would be on TV. If you get it, you're not going to be spreading it. Right. You won't kill grandma, and you won't end up in the hospital.
Right.
And then you're watching the news come out of Israel, and that by summer 2021, they were talking third dose. So then I was like, well, wait a sec. They're human. We're human. They got coronavirus. We got coronavirus. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't jive with what Biden's saying, because he's saying, you got your 2 shots, you'll be done. You're not going to spread it. But with very, very high vaccination rates in Israel, at the time the highest in the world because it was so early, the numbers were still going up so much, they needed a third dose. So like, obviously they're spreading it to each other.
Yeah.
So forget about this. I'm going to do it for the community because it isn't like you brought over your cousin Seth to the bar mitzvah who's unvaccinated. In this case, you would be Seth at your father's birthday party and got everybody sick. That just wouldn't work out numerically. And if that happened, you'd be hearing about that all the time.
Yeah.
One unvaccinated cousin came over and kicked off everybody who was vaccinated.
Right.
That's what the whole point. They have protection against that.
Yeah.
So I'm like, just by sheer numbers at that point in time, when even if the unvaccinated person was spreading it more, they are vastly in the minority of the population in general.
Right.
So, if they spread it at twice the rate, let's say, I'm just making up a number, but they represent 10% of the population, that's never going to have an effect greater than the 90% or spreading it at half that rate.
Yeah.
Because they're in the 90%, right? So I'm like, okay, it might have some mitigation, and then it's waning, and then you need a third shot. So for me, at that point, it was like, I'm just going to play precautionary, based on health, based on community. I'm like, I don't know if this is the right move for everybody. Certainly grandpa, grandma, comorbidities, go for it. But to have this unfortunate situation where your father is sort of like calling you out, thinking, why didn't you get the vax? And then really your retort probably was why should I get the vax?
Right.
And these talking points he wouldn't know about because he's just sort of following mainstream, hearing the typical like Biden, get it? This is the way out of the pandemic.
Yeah. And often happens, it almost comes back to the messaging and the media and stuff like that. And like, at the time, we argued a bit then, and it was, we both, I'll never forget his saying, like I follow the science, like literally, saying that, which has become such a meme now. It's like, and when I was it's not like I was sitting there rationally discussing. I was angry too because I was flustered. And I was like, well, I just listened to this episode of Dark Horse. My God, like, don't you know what's going on? So it's like you kind of get both of that, right?
Of course.
And that's not conducive to like having a real dialogue. So there was some part of me that I'm like, you know what, I don't want to get anybody sick, and like I don't know 100%, right? So like I want to make sure I respect everything. So I wore a mask there and everything like that. But it really made me think, this is where like things have broken down. Like if I can't, because I was saying, I'm like, listen, like you're okay. You said you follow the science, but let's talk about the science then. And he's like, well, you're not a virologist or you're not a doctor. It's like, I know I'm not a doctor, but like, I can still, read things and listen to other doctors.
These are
like,
opinions from other doctors.
One
doctor might say, you need a hip replacement and we need to do this very, invasive surgery. you're like, I don't know. I'm going to ask someone else. Well, don't you just listen to that doctor? You're not a doctor, even though it's your hip. But wait a sec. I found another batch of experts. They may be in the minority, but they're well regarded and they seem to have a good effect. And then you have free sovereignty over your own body.
Yeah.
You pick the choice
So
you want to
far,
go to.
anyway.
So far, yeah. Yeah, that's a whole other topic. Like how far, can you mandate something on somebody's body when it's actually still disagreed upon so much around the world?
Right.
Like a polio vaccine. Everyone's like, yes, polio is very dangerous, and this is an excellent vaccine, and we have like a 99.9% agreement amongst the intellectual community globally. Yeah. But when you have this sort of gray zone where maybe 75% of doctors agree in one direction and 25% of the countries in the world and doctors are going in a different direction, is that the level in which you can start mandating things? I don't know.
Yeah.
So at that point, that gray zone is where you find yourself with your father. Because you're not in a 99-1 scenario. You're like in a 50-50, 75-25% scenario.
Right.
But they're acting like it's a 99, like a sure thing.
Yeah. So, and so what I'm trying to say to him at this point is like, you're saying you follow the science. Okay, then let's do this scientific method kind of, let's look at it as if we were, using scientific method. Like, let's look at some studies. Let's compare that with the risk profile that I've assessed of myself and, and look at the stats as to how many people are getting seriously ill, like based on their age and based on their comorbidities, et cetera. But he didn't want to hear that. And it's like, never mind the censorship, the stuff about the VAERS database. Like I didn't, without even getting into that.
Do you have any insight why he didn't want to hear it?
I think, I've asked a couple of people about this as well. And I think that it's just overall people as they get, people are it depends on the generation that you're at. And I think his generation is such that you could trust the media to some extent and the government to some extent.
Sure.
Like, and, they still had, Vietnam and everything like that. Yeah. So it's not like there's this blind trust, but at some point you're like, you have to defer, and there's some wisdom to this. You have to defer to the experts, so-called experts, right? And there is a wisdom in that. I do get that. Like it's more, you want a doctor making a decision over your health. Yeah. Like you're not just going to go in, and like you go in for treatment on something, you have like, well, I did all these Google searches. This is what I think you should do.
Going back to Vietnam, if you were the soldier, the individual sovereign soldier, like, I think we should just go take this village. And I'm going.
Right. Yeah.
And there has to be. It's like, wait a second, I've got a plan. It may not be the perfect plan.
Right.
But we should win in the end, and there'll be some attrition along the way. But overall, on a population national level, we'll win the battle.
Yeah, it's like, and I'm a general, so I kind of know what I'm doing to some extent. But it's, and I think there's some wisdom in that, but I think it's like we live in an age now where you have access to a lot of different data that we didn't have before, and you can't kind of discount that. And we also happen to live in an age where, I don't find, politicians are not necessarily in the game for the right reasons anymore. And by politicians, I also would stretch that to be like, the leaders of various governmental organizations as well. So, and I think that between that and this kind of like media always on, like, nobody wants to look bad. Everyone wants to sort of stick to the talking points. Like it's become this cauldron of like potentiality for like just bad things to happen, where bad decisions can be made and they can be amplified. And it's like when you shoot for the moon, if your calculations are off a little bit, it might be off like an inch or something like that, because of the distance, you're just going to be way off of your trajectory. And it's kind of like that. So it's like, and I think that, it really pays, I hate using the word holistic, but it pays to have a holistic view of these kinds of things now. Like you have to get your information from more than one source. You have to question everything, and you have to advocate for yourself.
And short-term planning versus long-term planning. Like, for instance, you might be looking out after your personal health over the next 50 years.
Yeah.
Whereas, to be honest, I think the government's just worried about, oh my God, our civilization nearly collapsed. Right? What do we need to do to get to the next fiscal quarter?
Right.
Now, this vaccines will get us that quarter. Most people will have a good experience with the vaccine. Some won't, but that's acceptable losses. We need to move on. We'll deal with the losses as we go.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really feel good when you're thrown into that batch or told you're a bad person, or you've had your 2 shots or third one, and then you have a really bad reaction on an emotional individual level. You're like, I don't want to do anymore. Mm-hmm. And that has to be respected at a certain point. Like, you're going to be on your 7th booster and be like, I think I need to stop. The last 3 really made me feel sick. well, then I guess you're just an anti-vaxxer.
Right.
Where does this?
Yeah.
The verbiage has changed now. They come, you don't have your you don't have it updated.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
so they're trying, but this is very Windows-esque. You don't have the
Yeah,
newest
yeah,
update.
yeah.
You can't run the software. What's the software?
Yeah.
Freedom.
Why,
Because
you
freedom-
don't want to go to Windows 11? Like, what's
yeah,
wrong with
yeah,
you?
yeah,
You've got
yeah.
the hardware, just do it.
Yeah, you can. Of course, you cannot upgrade, but you know, this and that, right? So,
Right.
so that's the scary part. I don't like freedom as a subscription service.
Yeah, that's good.
You know, Brian Peckford is the last living signatory that's he's suing the government over he's one of the last architects over the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So he's alive and he's suing the government because like what they're doing right now is illegal.
Right.
So I don't know if it is illegal or not illegal. My point is though, he's certainly a qualified politician,
Right.
storied history, of age now, living, architect of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, big
Yeah.
court case, not on the news whatsoever.
Yeah. I know who you mean, and it's kind of like having in the U.S. like somebody who one of the original authors of the Constitution, and you sort of get into you'll often get into this interpretation game where it's like, well, that's not what they meant by freedom of blah 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 blah.
Imagine George Washington taking the government to court. No, this is not how we set up the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, you guys
Whatever,
got it
George
wrong.
Washington, we the people. You're just one of many.
Yeah.
Like so. Again, it's beyond my pay grade, but it should be talked about. And these are serious issues, right?
Yeah.
And I did see one speech of his, and there's many great podcasts of them you can find on YouTube and whatnot, like 1, 2, 3 hour long discussions. But he's like, these are not your familial rights. These are not your provincial rights. These are not your country rights. These are your individual rights.
Right.
And I think it's a way of speech that we don't even have anymore. Like your father, when
Yeah.
he's talking to you in the yard, he's talking to you from a familial point of view, a group immunity, a group, setting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Be like, yes, but as an individual, I don't wish to do this. So,
Yeah.
and that's where I think the schism, it's almost like it's conceptual. It's way beyond just whether it's a vaccine or not.
Yeah.
Like, are you part of our tribe? Therefore, you must do this because the tribe survival matters most.
Right.
Right? Which is acceptable way of thinking if, like you said, the vaccine was of a certain efficacy and of a certain prevention of transmission and infection, which it isn't.
Yeah. So my dad and I argued then, and it wasn't just him. It was sort of everyone in my family. Like, and I want to take this opportunity. Like, I'm not trying to bash my dad, or anyone. It's like I really think that the way I was talking to him, it's not like I was like some sage of wisdom, and I said, "Oh, sit down. Let me explain to you. Like, I've got some tea brewing." Like, it's very, I was like just as heated. So, and one of the reason I bring all this stuff up is just to think like this is really the catalyst, I think, for me, where I thought like, why can't I talk to my dad anymore? Like, why can't we have this kind of discussion where we used to have, and like we would take different sides of a debate, and it would be like,
Cool.
We'd figure it out. Like,
yeah.
you know what I mean? And by the way,
Is it because there's life and death involved? Have the
I don't think
stakes been
so,
upped,
because even from the beginning of the Trump era, I would say our conversations would end in this whole, this thing where it's like, well, we have to agree to disagree, and it's this whole but it's not really. We're not agreeing to do anything. Like it's just a way of saying like, I don't agree with you at all, and like this is bullshit. But like, so. I think that in some ways, it's it just this sort of amplified things with the with COVID, where like you said, maybe there's life and death. And my dad's older too, so like I understand it from his perspective. I was happy when they got the vaccine, like, which is I hope I don't end up regretting. I hope
Yeah, me too.
But like I was, I'm like they're older. I'm worried about them getting COVID more than I'm worried about me getting COVID. So it's like. But in the end of the day, maybe I shouldn't have worried that much about it, and maybe it would have been fine if they didn't get the vaccine. But anyway,
nobody
who
knew.
knows?
Nobody knew, and they were certainly my parents too. They're in that age bracket where you're like, you know what, put your seatbelt on, drive slow, and have airbags. Whatever
exactly.
I can do to make you safe, right?
For sure. So this became the catalyst where I thought, you know what, I can't even talk to my dad anymore. What is happening in society and you would hear stories about this all the time, like people, families, like dinner tables, like, and I knew quite a few people who were unvaccinated. And, we would hear the same sorts of things from their families where they would constantly be getting in, fights at the dinner table, couldn't come over or whatever. I guess the dinner table in the garage or wherever. But it was like a national and international phenomenon. So, I started thinking, like, how do I even communicate with, everybody is so calcified in their response to this.
Did you hear that the Canadian military, it was in, I believe, most major publications, admitted that they had been using military-grade psychological operations on the Canadian populace to test them out? Did you hear that? So what we've been under in the last 12 to 24 months now is a military-grade psychological, like psyops, in order to coax the population into a certain direction. So your father, and we're all subject to this, has, let's say, you used to have reasonable disagreements, and now because of this, you're having unreasonable disagreements. And that's not the way your relationship was normally geared up. And that's where psychology is starting to take it's shaping the bipolarness of the conversation with very little middle ground. And the fact that can happen on a national level is scary enough, but now it's happening on a familial level.
Right.
Right. And so I don't think you can discount the amount of psychological pressure. Everybody's taken a hit during this time. It can be financial, relationships, occupational, and psychological.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what you're experiencing. And the only antidote to that would be just more information. But that takes time. Mm-hmm. It depends on who is giving the information. You standing in the backyard with a beer in your hand telling your father, I know about all these wonder drugs, isn't going to resonate the same way as coming from the mayor of the city and the chief medical officer and what's on the national news. Like at that point, your father, as much as he loves you, is going to be like, these people are getting paid big bucks. And research this to death. And I love my son, and he kind of knows a few things, but
not about this.
yeah. But they're going to shift back to, because 9 times out of 10, that's going to be the right answer. You're going to go with those who are the bona fide experts, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where the narrative, because, it doesn't take much. You have elected in Canada, we have elected officials, but they're now listening to science tables of unelected scientists who are small in number and not taking in, as you said earlier, a holistic approach to society. So the politician, I would like to think, would listen to these medical experts regarding the, COVID crisis, but also talk to mental health experts, economists, spousal abuse, social workers and whatnot, and take a whole picture and figure out what's going on. That type of perspective has not been propagated in mainstream media whatsoever. It is simply, there's one problem, COVID, and there's one solution, the vaccines. And any deviation from that is like being a heretic.
Right.
And that's where you get gamed into this psychological painted into a corner sort of thing. So like any animal, when you're stuck in a corner, that's when they lash out. Right? Yep. There's little wiggle room in the room anymore. You're painted into a corner, and this is the only exit.
And the messaging, and speaking about like a psyop, like the messaging is so consistent and so just constant that you can understand where it's like any deviation from that is like, what are you talking about? I follow the science. Everyone follows the science. So you got to follow the science.
You've seen the movie 1984. You've seen the imagery, and when you have the big face on the screen bearing down, telling everybody the war on Oceania is going like this, and we've always been at war and peace and whatever, and it's some tyrannical face. And as kids, you would watch it going, well, obviously, like who would listen to a screaming person just their one face talking on the screen with the same message day after day? But you turn on CP24. And then 75 to 80% of the screen is usually a single face talking to you, telling the single message. Yeah. But you never thought it would be sprinkled with the traffic updates and the weather going vertical and horizontal on the two bottom and side corners. Yeah. But 80% of the screen is very much like 1984. Yeah. It is a single face telling you a single narrative day after day after day, sprinkled with some traffic updates and weather updates.
And of course, you have other opinions, you have other narratives, you have other people who are doing research that come to different conclusions. And that stuff is either ridiculed or it's shoved aside or it's demonetized, I guess. Like, like if you can't vocalize that anywhere, or if when you do, you're sort of, you're castigated as like a fake news spreader or whatever, or an anti-vax or whatever the pejorative that you want to use to describe somebody like that, it becomes very difficult. You start to think like, well, do you want to spend your days like making a living and supporting your family, or do you want to spend your days telling the truth, which happens to be different than what's currently being the messages that are currently being sent forth. So like there really is like sort of a general narrative, and whether it's like some sort of conscious, like, I don't know how much you were talking about it being a military psyop to some extent, which, but it's like, is this, even if it's just some sort of like, almost like a communal subconscious thing where like, the governments of the world have all agreed, like, like Trudeau, for example, like, I remember at the beginning, I would question some of the stances he's taking. We started locking things down. He's like, well, he's following the Health Canada protocols. And it's like, okay, well, that's, like you said, like, that's one thing he should be listening to for sure. Like, you want to base your opinion on the experts there, but there's other like fields that you have to take into consideration as the leader of a country.
There was a country called Sweden,
right,
a very serious country, doing things in a different way. We had our live experiment happening right in front of our eyes. Mm-hmm. And of course, these viral things come in waves. So you're going to sometimes be, you're going to be having more and more outbreaks, and then lesser, depending on what mechanisms you're having and the weather and everything else. But there was just the fact that, like, it was about 1 year ago now that we were all looking on TV, seeing Costco had 1,000 people inside, but the small florist down the street that has like normally like 6 customers a day had to be mandated closed. And every person at home is going, this can't be science.
Right.
Can you show me how you can I can meet my parents in aisle 36 at Walmart, right? But we can't sit at the dinner table with the window open in the house. Fine, I'll play ball. It's okay. And I totally did. I would give myself an A+ and challenge anybody on a personal level who did more over this period of time. Mm-hmm. I just hugged my mother for the first time on Tuesday since Christmas 2019. Okay. But at a certain point, hand on my heart.
I would sneak hugs to my mom. we were both, it's like a silent compact we had.
That's wonderful. And I'm a little annoyed that I actually was such a good soldier the whole time, But there does come that moment where you have to like reconcile your actions with the data. Mm-hmm. And you can't just become habitual. It's like the masking. At a certain point, yes, my wife made over 1,000 masks and gave them to family members and sold them at a very at a loss. And we're just happy to to help out. But there is going to be a point in the pandemic where we're like, the efficacy of the mask in face of the Omicron is no longer what it's worth. But why are they still telling us to wear it? Now it becomes more like a psychological muzzle. This is what the good people do. This is how the intelligent ones behave and act.
Right.
These are the conscientious people. And it becomes a self-propagating kind of new norm. It's like wearing a bicycle helmet. Do you think there's a cop hiding behind a tree every second that's going to give you a ticket?
Yeah.
But it becomes a new norm. It becomes ingrained in civilization. And I think that's the point now in masking that we're facing, is that it's actually going to become the norm to be the person wearing the mask, the better person, the more conscientious person. That's where it becomes like a psyop.
Yeah.
Because that was not the original intention. And to sell it as anything more than that is not disingenuous.
Yeah.
So I
think that like podcasting is really emerging as one of the few mediums left to have conversations about this kind of thing with, sort of a community of people who want to hear a different side and want to sort of engage in that, like, it's nobody wants to feel alone, and like you could think, like, imagine there weren't any podcasts.
Well,
imagine there weren't any like articles coming out. You'd be like, okay, this doesn't feel right to me, but I don't know, like everybody else seems to be doing it.
Like historically, people would meet in the cafes and taverns and have a bottle of wine or a coffee shops of Europe and just have intellectual conversations and overhear a conversation and join in. And, it was or like in Europe, you also have, which we should have more in North America, like piazzas and squares where people would congregate and someone might start like speaker's corner, like talking, and people would just listen. And the podcast, I think, is the single best method to do that because it's slower, takes more time, there's lots of room for nuance, and it really is the digital equivalent of the global village, Whereas when you watch television and there's money involved, power structures, subsidies by governments, and narratives that have to be pushed, of course shorter time frames, you're not going to have the room for that nuance. And certainly typing something on Facebook or Twitter isn't simply not going to give you the breadth of space to be able to engage with a person the same way.
Yeah.
So I actually think conversations like this are imperative to repair some of the damage that's happening within families and society at large. Because I overwhelmingly believe most people, the vast majority of most people, just want the best for everybody. They truly do. And that's not how the anger and the fissure in society is being portrayed whatsoever. The people on one side, anti-maskers, really think they're doing the right thing for society. The truckers, this was like, some of them were willing to die. That's how much they believe they're doing the right thing. And the people on the other side think they're doing the right thing too. And the only way you're going to get through that is long conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. One neighbor to another. In my business, I talk to a different person for an hour every hour, 5-6 days a week. And there's always a moment. I kind of treat some of the information I know as a prescription. Like, how much can I possibly give them?
Yeah.
But I try a little bit to just wake them up or nudge them. And certainly I'm more than willing to have it come back at me, because the last thing I want are my own stale thoughts banging around my head.
Right.
That's growth. That's like watering a plant.
Yeah.
And as long as both people are approaching it from a human, kind, trying to solve the issues point of view, that is what matters, not the actual information.
Yeah.
The information will sort itself out. The point that we're actually having this dialogue, trying to fix it, is the most important thing. The moment we stop talking to one another and just listening to our TV sets is when it's the game over.
Yeah, I agree. And to some extent, we're all slaves to the algorithms, right? Like, we're all, we all have our little silos, and we are reinforced by the algorithms always telling us what we should do, and
prying the worst parts of our personalities to the most extreme forms.
Yeah, for sure. And that is, it's pretty clear to me that that's at least one of the major things that's happening and why we sort of behave this way. So it's like a good analogy with watering the plant. Like, whenever I listen to a podcast or read a book, like I find those two are very analogous in the sense that it's very nourishing. Like, I feel nourished when I'm doing it, sure. And not everyone obviously, but it's like, but it. Like, if everybody did that and we could have conversations like this, it's like everything gets better again, The
sad thing for me, I would love to hear more information about why the stances and points of view I have are wrong from a well-balanced, calculated, educated, well-researched point of view.
Yeah.
Overwhelmingly, when I talk to people by and large in the regular world, and of course on TV, I don't get that. I just get very little cliche slogans thrown back. Do your part. Roll up your sleeve, take 2 shots and go to Aruba. Like it's just, yeah. I mean, shots and Aruba kind of go together, but maybe not in terms of vaccines, Yeah. But the fact that I'm not getting the nourishment back from the other mechanisms, I wish I am wrong about everything. That would be the easiest thing in the world, But I don't see the information to say that I'm wrong, right? Anywhere. And then you said your radar goes up, your BS meter starts ticking, going, there's no way I'm 100% right, but there's no way I'm 100% wrong. The truth is in the middle, and I'm not hearing any of my talking points, even 20, 25, 30% of them being spoken about in regular conversations, regular media. And the people I talk to are pretty open. Like, I feel like they trust me, the nature of my work and whatnot. I give them their space to be them. It's what it's all about. So sometimes I get some back, but not nearly enough. So that's where then you start feeling like they've been damaged a little bit over the way, and they're just reclusive.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like peer pressure. Like, nobody wants to say they like the top bands and the top styles in their hair, back in the 80s, and you must be on trend. And it's almost like information has to be on trend.
Yeah.
And if you want to deviate from that at all, be ahead of the curve or a little more nichier, you're going to be just ostracized like a high school.
Yeah.
And it's like intellectual ostracization via peer pressure and lack of well-balanced information.
You made a good point the other day where you kind of likened it to the bands and like liking the cool bands or whatever, and it's almost like this signal that when you get to a new juncture, so it's like, okay, things are sort of opening up now. Omicron seems to have really finally sort of flattened the curve, and you get people almost fishing for what's the next thing I need to cling to, and sort of signaling like, are you going to be wearing your mask like all the time? Or
I get asked daily.
It's
They're
weird.
testing me out.
Yeah,
They're like,
yeah.
I'm like, and I'm like, yes, I think the mask could have came off September, October. Really, to be quite honest. So I feel like the government is behind the curve, not going too fast.
Right.
That being said, I wore it no problem throughout the winter. I don't want to be a little extra safe. But so even though I saw the data clearing up in September, October, okay, I'll give it a little extra time.
Right.
I feel like we've already used that buffer of time. Whereas most people are like, okay, here's the cutoff date, but how much buffer of extra time do I want to give it till I'm really sure? Yeah. Right. And so I made this point to my own parents. I'm like, well, if the government is usually behind and we should have done this then definitely you can take it off now, because the government is usually erring on the side of extra precautious and safety.
Right.
So if this is their cutoff date, you can almost guarantee it was safer 2-3 months ago.
Yeah. So yeah, I think as it taking all this into consideration, what my own experience, and I think a lot of your experience as well, which we didn't really get to today, but we can in the future, is what we want this show to be about for the most part is to deconstruct arguments and to get what we need to abolish in this country and in the Western world is throughout the whole world. Let me say that is this idea where we can't talk to each other anymore. Like we can't live like this. Like nobody can live like this. So let's start having conversations again, and let's both parties try to get to a point where they're just both seeking the truth.
I completely agree with you. And we'll get into that in the next episode, but it's going to be a hard one because the authoritarianism and centralization of information and opinion is really running opposite of democracy and individual points of view almost. It's a very strange energy these days.
But that's why you have to take a step back and look at an argument, any argument, and say, okay, let's reverse engineer the argument. Let's find out what it is somebody's saying. Somebody's telling me, you have to get the vaccine. Why do I need the vaccine? Here are the statistics. Like why when I have a 99.9% chance of survival and there's no real known major side effects, and people talk of this vague long COVID. Okay, maybe there's something like that there, but even still, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to be pretty okay. Or do I go with the vaccine? And you know what I mean? You get you have the risk profiles. You have the getting back to ivermectin. It's like
when persuasion turns to coercion, it's a failure of transparency and messaging. I think that's exactly the problem, because it was a persuasive, like, get it, it's good for you, until about June in the States, June-ish, because they were ahead of us, June 2021. And that's when they hit 50, 57%, and they noticed that the average person is going to come out has now stopped. How do we take it from 50, 60% to 70, 80, 90%?
Yeah.
That's when the wheels of coercion kicked in. And that is a failure of messaging. And why do we have that failure? Why is there a lack of transparency? Why does the FDA want to release the papers of Pfizer's data over a 75-year period? Red flags go off. Right. Out of a base, if a person is on a side of precaution and they see that those who are administering the drug are delaying the release of the information regarding this drug for a 75-year period, they are going to be naturally cautious going forward, right?
Yeah.
So that's to your point. I think that's the problem, is that it's switched from persuasion to coercion because of a poor messaging and transparency.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think on that we should leave it for today. And this is our first podcast, so we're talking to ourselves at the moment, but
it's been a blast.
It has been a blast,
and it will get better and better. And this is what it's all about: learning together, talking, working it out, just always being intellectually curious and kind-hearted.
Well said. Well said. We got to think of a cool tagline at some point. Right now, we'll just say a very abrupt goodbye. Goodbye.
Peace out.